Hello and welcome to the Amoral Philosophy podcast. This is the first episode in a series of conversations on philosophy of religion. And we have a special guest tonight whose name is Dima Zhyvov. He is a good friend of mine whom we started to study philosophy with together many years ago through the University of London International Program. But this is not the only reason why I invited Dima to the show tonight. In addition to him being a philosophy student and one of the sharpest minds that I know, he also teaches theology in the Christian tradition at the School of Biblical Studies here in the UK. He's originally from Ukraine, but he has lived and taught in Sweden before moving to the UK. And given that Dima's two big passions are philosophy and theology, he is the ideal guest to talk on the philosophy of religion too. He also makes an excellent interlocutor because, unlike me, he is clearly a theist, that is, someone who believes in God's existence. So he's a perfect companion for exploring the issues of philosophy of religion together. So hello, Dima, and welcome to the show.
Hello, Anton.
Yes, I'm very, very glad to see you on here today. Let me know if I missed something in the introduction, if you'd like to add a couple words or...
You were very generous. Thank you so much. Well, all I can add is that I am super excited and I'm very grateful for this invitation. So I look forward to what we're going to do together.
Excellent. Thanks very much. So perhaps we should start by saying a few words about why we chose this particular topic, why we want to talk about religion, about philosophy of religion. Why is it important to you? And then maybe I'll add a couple of words from myself.
Yes. Why religion? I think the most obvious thing to say is that many people are impacted by it. The vast majority of humanity are and have been religious. So it occupies a lot of people's thinking, their lives. And so if we want to understand ourselves, if we want to understand our society, if we're curious to understand the world in general, I think it's just important to think about religion seriously and try to make sense of this phenomenon.
Absolutely. So for most people, when we start talking about religion, the first concept that comes to mind is God. And obviously there'll perhaps be many of our viewers or listeners out there who are non-believers themselves. And some of them might think, well, if I don't believe in God, how is religion and philosophy of religion relevant for me? Why should I be interested in these topics? Do you have something to say to them?
Yes, I would say you can't avoid living alongside many people who are religious. So it might interest you to try to understand where they're coming from. I think also it's great to keep having an open mind. Perhaps there is a particular religion that has convincing reasons in its favor. And so I think we're all trying our best to pursue the truth, or at least that's the hope. And that we should be open-minded about what's true and keep that inquiry going. So those would be my two main reasons.
Right. These are great points. Perhaps on a personal note, I should agree with you that being open-minded is very important. I may confess that I introduced myself as clearly not a theist, but I had my doubts over the course of my life, and I shifted back and forth. And I think philosophical arguments played a very important role in exploring these issues. So I think this could be important for our viewers and listeners, regardless of what background they come in from. Perhaps one more point to add is that philosophy of religion as a discipline pulls in so many different threads from other areas of philosophy, including philosophy of mind, language, logic, epistemology, that it could be very intellectually stimulating as a field, even if someone is not necessarily interested in its content.
That's right.
Right. So our first question was about why take an interest in religion. And the second one, I think, would be, what does philosophy of religion study as a field?
Right.
So of course there is a difference between religion itself and philosophy of religion. So perhaps a few words about that.
Yeah. Let me try to be brief about that. So Philosophy of religion is the philosophical examination of the themes and concepts involved in religious traditions, as well as the broader philosophical task of reflecting on matters of religious significance, such as the nature of religion itself, certain alternative conceptions or concepts of God or ultimate reality, as well as certain general features of the world that might, again, have religious significance. For example, the laws of nature, the emergence of consciousness, historical events and their meaning, if at all. So that's kind of, in broad strokes, what philosophy of religion studies. But crucially for our purposes, it includes investigation of worldviews, sort of big picture theories about reality, about all that exists, about our place in the world, including alternative to religions worldviews, such as secular humanism. So that's where arguments for and against God's existence might come handy, because that would be pertinent to whether secular naturalism is true if there is no God, or whether it's false if there is. So, and like you said, it's a vibrant field. There are a lot of articles published on it in philosophy journals. People are interested in the topic, and it is such a rich field in terms of the intersection between philosophy of religion and many other areas. So let me just give examples of specific questions that philosophy of religion might study and how it relates to various fields. So for example, metaphysics. This is the field of philosophy that has to do with existence and the nature of things. And philosophy of religion might ask the question that if God exists, how is God related to abstract objects? Or how is God related to time, for instance? And to answer that question, you have to delve deep into the metaphysics of time, into the arguments for and against the existence of abstract objects. Are they real entities? Are there such things as numbers and sets and propositions that are causally effete, but are still there in just as robust a sense in which you and I are there? And with philosophy of time, if God is in some way involved in the very existence of the universe, presumably he's related in some kind of causal way to it, or he sustains it in existence. How to make sense of that if he is timeless? Does he have to be temporal in order to sustain the world from moment to moment? So these are just examples of the relation between philosophy of religion and metaphysics. Or think of epistemology, the field that studies the theory of knowledge, tries to understand what is knowledge, what are the limits of knowledge, skepticism, what is justification, how can we be rational in our beliefs, which beliefs are rational, and so on. Obviously, this is super pertinent because we can apply some of that to philosophy of religion and ask, well, what about our religious convictions? Are we justified in believing that there is a God? How would you even go about justifying a belief like that? Is it in principle different from other kinds of beliefs that we hold? Another example would be, what about religious experience? Can you have a kind of direct awareness or knowledge of God? And can you back that up through philosophical reasoning? So that's an example of interconnection that's exciting between philosophy of religion and epistemology. Gosh, let's just a few more. Philosophy of language. A huge debate is, for instance, in philosophy of religion has to do with the use of language in talking about God. Are our concepts that we usually derive from our experience of the world, are they adequate to describe ultimate reality? Are they adequate to describe God if he existed? Or do they necessarily fail? And is there such a thing as analogical use of language that perhaps might be helpful here, right? Can we speak in pictures about God? is that what theology is about, right? So these are the questions that that philosophy of language might raise for philosophy of religion, and philosophy of religion has to reckon with that in its thinking about God. So yeah, those are just a few examples, but obviously we can go on. If you want me to give more examples, like philosophy of history, the issues
Right.
of miracles and so on, rationality again and believing in them. What should our methodology be when it comes to the miraculous and so on? Yeah.
Right. No, this is a great introduction. Well, perhaps we'll have a chance to talk more about this when we list the topics that we'll cover in this series. But I think this might be the right moment for us to say what we're trying to do with this series, because our listeners may think, well, there's a lot of content out there on the philosophy of religion. So what is different about what we're trying to do with this series of podcasts?
Yes. The reason why I'm so excited about it is that I think that it's rare to see, especially now with all the polarization that exists in the world, it's rare to see a clear-headed discussion about important matters, which also exemplifies cordiality, mutual respect, pursuit of truth for its own sake, non-partisanship. So I really hope for these series to be quite raw in the sense that I want to come at it not as a kind of religious apologist trying to win a debate or argument. I want to come at it afresh. I want us to investigate it in good faith, to acknowledge weaknesses of our positions, to acknowledge unanswered questions, and to enjoy it together. I think there's tremendous value in having such conversations, and my hope just is that this series would encourage others to do the same and to have friendships where they could talk about matters of great significance together in a good way.
Right. I totally agree with that. And I think this series should be an excellent opportunity for us to explore the arguments and concepts together. Also in an attempt to show the audience not only how to think about such matters as religion, but more generally about how philosophy is done. To have an exchange of arguments and keep your mind open and see where the argument gets you at the end of the day. But also one feature perhaps of this series is that we'll also encourage questions from the audience at any point, and perhaps if we have enough questions, we may either do a separate episode on that or touch on them in one of our future podcasts. At this point, I think we should just go ahead and do a brief introduction of the topics that we are planning to cover in the future episodes of this series. For now, I understand we don't know how many episodes will follow. We've just broadly sort of outlined the terrain and see for you to be able to see what questions we'll be discussing.
Yeah, so we will aim at spending a good deal of time on discussing one of the principal questions in at least Western philosophy of religion, which is whether or not God or gods exist. So we will look at particular arguments for and against the existence of God in quite some detail. But before we do that, I think we both agreed that it would be proper to, first of all, define important terms. So the next episode will be dedicated to definitions. We will try to define what atheism is, what theism is, various other positions that one can adopt towards propositions about God, and so on. We will try to define religion more precisely. As well as define the concept of God that will be operative when we will be arguing for and against. But at the same time, we also want to talk about something that is often a heated thing, which has to do with the burden of proof. Who bears the burden of proof, and when, and how? And so that's another subject that we want to go into. And we also need to lay a kind of foundation, I think, or sort of agree on our methodology or agree on our approach to arguments and evidence for or against God's existence. So we will look at, for instance, something called a cumulative approach, or a way of sort of presenting a case for a position that might rely on various threads, not just a single piece of data, and where we're seeking to sort of explain all the relevant data by a particular hypothesis, whether it is theism or atheism. So so that's what we need to do, but also obviously we need to get to the particular arguments. And I thought that perhaps a good way to do that, because there are literally dozens and like really many arguments on both sides for us to consider. But I thought it could be helpful to approach it in the following way, that there are 4 traditional categories of arguments or families of arguments that have been prominent in philosophy of religion. The first one is the cosmological argument, or again, the cosmological arguments. Then the moral arguments, then something called teleological arguments, and ontological arguments. That would be on a pro side, on the positive side for theism. And so let me just would you like me to just briefly define
Sure,
the terms that I just
absolutely.
used? Yeah. So the cosmological arguments have to do with basically, well, it's in the name, right? Cosmos. So what we do there is that we take a particular feature of the cosmos that cries out for an explanation. So that feature could be, for example, that contingent things exist, or that feature could be that things undergo change, and so on, or that the universe began to exist. And then we seek to explain that in terms of the first cause, which first cause is God. So we're seeking to sort of explain a particular general feature often of the observable universe. So this is an example of a posteriori reasoning, which is reasoning based on experience, where you do observe the world and, in this case, observe certain effects, and then reason backwards to likely possible necessary causes of those effects. Now, the second family of arguments is the moral arguments, right? And there, I mean, this is very, the territory there again is vast, but essentially, again, we're interested in whether morality in some sense, be it the very fact that there are embodied conscious agents that interact in moral ways with one another, that there are moral communities, that we are moral agents, whether that gives us a reason to think that there is a God behind it all. Or we might ask, for instance, whether we need a God to account for the existence of objective moral values and duties. So here, God would be a kind of foundation for objective moral facts. Another version of the argument might try to show that God best explains the possibility of our moral knowledge. And so those are just examples of what moral arguments are trying to do, just take some feature of morality and then relate it to God in a kind of evidentiary way, that this gives you grounds for thinking that there is a God, or and so on. Now, then I mentioned teleological arguments. It has to do with essentially purposes, goals, telos, ends. It has to do with design. And so we could call it design arguments. And again, there are many, many kinds, but we will just focus on a particular kind, which has to do with the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. So I will talk more about that later as we come to that. And then there's a family of arguments that are called ontological, right? And they have to do with the nature of God, which the concept of God expresses. And the attempt there is to, on the basis of just thinking about the very concept of God and the idea of God and the possibility of that idea being instantiated in the world, the possibility of such a God's existence, say, that you can actually successfully reason for that to his actual existence. So, and it's notorious for for its bold claim that you can, in an a priori way, in a way that just relies on thought, you can reason to God just from the concept of God, and maybe certain other claims about what that concept is capable of achieving. And and I thought that maybe the best way would be just to take one representative argument from that, from each class or each category, and then go deep into that and see whether it holds. And then on the con side of things, we want to look at least two arguments from evil, arguments that take facts about suffering in the world as key premise from which to argue that there cannot be a God, or it's unlikely that there is one. So that's the problem of evil family of arguments.
Right. So, well, as we discussed, this list of issues that we're planning to cover is pretty much open. So probably the arguments for and against God's existence are going to form the central part of what we're going to talk about. But then there are some sort of broader issues outside of necessarily arguing for or against God's existence, and exploring some issues that follow from God's existence or inexistence. In a way, you've already touched on when you talked about, for instance, moral argument for God's existence. So one of the things that we want to talk about is what, if anything, follows from God's existence, if we can prove that God exists or that he doesn't exist, to sort of explore the issues of our relation to God. Do we have any obligations to God, or does God have any obligations to us, perhaps? And also the issue that interests me a lot is the relation between morality and God, and we can talk about that both in the context of arguments for and against God's existence, but also outside of that, and think about questions such as, should we be afraid of losing morality if God doesn't exist, or does our belief in God commit us to certain meta-ethical views about what morality consists in, and how about the absence of belief to God, does that commit us to certain meta-ethical views, etc. And I think it will also be very interesting to talk about religious epistemology. You've already mentioned that we'll be discussing the issue of burden of proof, that is, who has to discharge the burden of proving the person who asserts that God exists, or the person who denies God existence. That is one of the issues in religious epistemology. Some other things that we could talk about is the nature of belief, of religious belief, and whether it's religious belief as a state of mind is somehow different from other beliefs that we may hold. And also talk about things like, do we need rational justification for our religious beliefs, or can sometimes the requirements for rational justification be relaxed because of the nature of the belief or not? And yeah, some other things that come to mind is whether a person who holds a religious belief needs to be able to defend that belief in certain circumstances at least, or does claiming that the nature of belief is religious sort of alleviate the necessity to justify it somehow? Does it put it in a separate category by some way? So I'd love to talk about that at some point. And touch on some topics perhaps in the philosophy of mind, such as internal and external contents of our religious beliefs. Here I'm thinking of things like relying on community or experts in justifying our beliefs, such as the case when a person that holds a religious belief perhaps is not well read enough, or doesn't know the details of the arguments for or against God's existence, but he is reliant on the people that he takes to be experts in the field. So perhaps that will be another area for us to explore. I don't know if we've left something out, but I think that there's like a lot for us to cover in the coming episodes. And that's why we sort of want to keep this list open, and we cannot predict how many episodes it would take.
That's right.
So, I mean, unless you have something to add at this point, should we just mention what our next episode is going to be on?
Yes, please. I think you captured it really well.
Excellent. So for our listeners, the next episode in this series is going to be on definitions and on the burden of proof. On definitions, we'll talk about definitions of God, religion, theism, and atheism. And on the burden of proof, we'll discuss things such as who bears the burden of proof when we argue for or against God's existence. So there's a lot to cover in the next episode.
Oh, yeah.
I think at this point, it just remains for me to thank Dima for joining us on this show. And I very much look forward to the next episode.
Me too. Thank you very much.
All right. So we'll see you all soon and stay well until then. Bye.
Bye-bye.